Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, good afternoon, class of 2017. Outstanding. Before we start, let me introduce a couple of our special guests with us today, your legacy class from the class of 1967, led by General Roger Carlton. Gentlemen, stand up and be recognized, please. Okay, did everybody have a good Thanksgiving break? Outstanding, outstanding. Well, you know, the academic year is almost half over. And no pun intended for a group of Air Force Academy cadets, time really does fly, doesn't it? I mean, it seems like just 6 months ago you were doolies, right? Well, not really, but you get my point. It doesn't seem like it's been that long ago, does it? And in 6 months, you are going to become Air Force Academy grads and members of the Long Blue Line. Now, I see we have some guests here. You may be wondering what the class is saying and why they're saying it. Well, at the beginning of their sophomore year, each academy class picks a military hero as their exemplar. And that hero becomes not only the honorary member of the class, the leader, but also its very namesake and identity. Now, the class of 2017 chose as its exemplar former Air Force Colonel George Bud Day. Colonel Day is the most decorated airman in history, having received not only the Air Force Cross, but the Congressional Medal of Honor. He was a fighter pilot in Vietnam, got shot down, and spent almost 6 years as a POW. His cellmate in prison was Senator John McCain, who said of Bud Day, he was the bravest man I ever knew. And his fierce resistance and resolute leadership set the example for us of how to return home with honor. A great exemplar for a great class of 2017. Now, that statement that I just made about you being a great class was not just hyperbole, because I've done my research and I've discovered that you are, in fact, a great class, and I want you to give yourselves a great round of applause for being the great class that you are. Of course, the question becomes, and it's a fair question, what makes you such a great class? Well, when you graduate this coming May, it'll be 44 years. And that time frame represents the number of years that you came after the class of 1973, the greatest class to ever graduate from this institution. I guess the lesson there is to know what you're clapping for, right? Yeah. Okay. So finals are right around the corner. Then you're going to be off on your winter break. And then you're going to come back for that long period of time between January and spring break. Now, back in the day, we had a nickname for it. I'm just curious. Do you call it anything special? Dark Ages. All right. It's good to see that the tradition still stands, because we call it the Dark Ages too. Because the days were short, the nights were long, and there was no more football. But unlike you guys and gals, we didn't have a bright light during those dark ages. And the bright light that you have is getting out of class 2 days in February to go off and see NCLS and see some of the greatest speakers you'll ever see. How many of you been to NCLS? Okay. Overwhelming majority. And how many of you enjoyed NCLS? Thought it's a good program? The overwhelming majority of the majority. Well, I'm proud that the illustrious class of 1973 is the flagship sponsor for NCLS. We've raised more than $2 million to endow a program that you say is a good program and that you enjoy. I've been here 8.5 years now, and I've been to every NCLS during my tenure. And I've seen 4-star generals and admirals speak. I've seen corporate CEOs, major sports figures from the NFL, Major League Baseball, and the WNBA. But I got to tell you, my all-time favorite panel at NCLS was in 2014. It was a panel of 5 cadets that told their story of how they got to the academy. And the stories were moving, they were motivating. In some cases, they were absolutely riveting. And as I sat there listening to these cadets, it occurred to me that other cadets over the years have probably come with unique stories as well, and it would be interesting to know what they had gone on to do in their careers. I reminisced about my own story as well, how I got to the academy, and I think I'm going to share just a small part of it with you today. But first, I got to ask you to take a trip with me back in time to when you were about 14 years old and you were about to begin your very first day of high school. I'm going to take just a second, see if you can get to that place. Okay? Now, how many of you can actually remember your very first day of high school? Let's see. All right. A few. And if you can't, no big deal, no worries. Tell you, I can hardly remember what happens yesterday sometimes. But if you were like most kids, it was an exciting day for you. Because now you were 14, you were going to be blessed, in a sense, as a real teenager. Now, the year before, you were 13, but you're still in 8th grade, right? Junior high, middle school, or whatever they call it these days. And so, technically a teenager, but not really. But 14, high school, well, now you're for real, right? Now, again, if you were like most kids, you might have been probably a little apprehensive as well. Because now you're in a new school, a much bigger school, a lot more kids, a lot older kids. And what do we call the newbies in high school? Freshmen, yeah. Or like we used to say, fresh meat when I was an upperclassman. And so exciting on the one hand, but maybe just a little intimidating as well. Well, my first day of high school was that for those reasons, but I had another reason to be a little apprehensive as well. You see, I'm from the Deep South, small southern town, Orangeburg, South Carolina. Nobody from Orangeburg in here, is it? And I came along in high school when segregation was still the law of the land. It was at a time and in a place where for a young black kid, opportunities were few. And I was about to become one of 12 kids that were integrating what had been previously all white Orangeburg High. And I will never forget my first day of high school. You see, there were 2 high schools in my hometown. The black high school, which was 1 block up and 2 blocks over from where I lived. And then there was a white high school way over on the other side of town, the white side of town. And we were going to have to be bused to go over there. Well, I left the house that morning. I went down to the end of the street to wait for the bus. I was by myself because I was the only kid from my neighborhood that was going to Orangeburg High. Well, after about 5 minutes or so, I looked off in the distance, and I saw these police cars coming down the street with the lights flashing. And I thought, wow, there must be a big accident someplace, or maybe even something more exciting like a robbery or a break-in. Well, imagine my surprise when that caravan of police cars stopped right in front of me. This was my federal marshal and state trooper escort for my first day of high school. So I got on the bus. We picked up a couple more kids along the way, and then we headed on over to Orangeburg High. I was sitting in the bus thinking, you know, this is pretty cool, having a police escort to go to school, until we pulled into the school parking lot. And we were greeted by this angry baseball bat, axe handle wielding mob who came up and started pounding on the side of the bus before the cops could come in and move them back. And they were yelling and screaming and shouting obscenities and racial slurs and telling us that we didn't belong over there, that we should turn around and go back home. And as I got off the bus and I walked down through these 2 lines of screaming humanity, being called names, being threatened, and being spat upon, I got to tell you, folks, that turning around and going back home seemed to be the smart thing to do. Certainly would have been the easier thing to do, but it wouldn't have been in keeping with the core values that my mom and dad, Willie and Pearl Thompson, had taught me. Values that, though stated differently, are the same values that we live by here at the Academy. Integrity, service, and excellence. You see, the choice to go to Orangeburg High had been mine. Now, my parents and I have certainly talked about the pros and the cons, but they had left the ultimate decision up to me. And as we were going through that process, my dad said to me, he said, you know, if you decide to go over there, then you're going to have to see it through, because you will have made a commitment. You will have given your word, and your word is the same as telling the truth. Integrity first. Now, to be honest with you, it would have been easier and more fun to have gone to Wilkinson. I could have hung out with my buds. But we talked about the importance to the community of integrating this school, not only to the African American community, but though they didn't appreciate it at the time, the white community as well. And we talked about what was both a pro and a con, which was being on the front lines of the civil rights movement and fighting the evils of bigotry and prejudice. Service before self. And when I told my parents that I had decided that I was going to go to Orangeburg High, my mother looked at me and she said, William, don't you shame us over there. It's going to be hard, but no matter how hard it gets, we expect you to do your best. Excellence in all you do. And so, despite the fear, and the fear was real, I didn't turn around and get back on that bus. I couldn't turn around and get back on that bus. And that became the first day of 4 years of 4 of the most challenging, but in many respects, 4 of the most insightful years of my life. In some respects, even more so than being a cadet here at the Academy. But it put me in a physical place one day to see something that literally changed my life. And it's always been difficult for me to convey exactly how I felt that day. It would have been better if you'd been there with me. If you could have seen what I saw, if you could have felt the emotion that I felt inside. You see, I was walking home from school that day, and I was feeling kind of down because it had been a particularly rough day for me at Orangeburg High. And as I walked along with my shoulders kind of slumped, my head hung down, all of a sudden this shadow enveloped me. For a brief moment, the sun had literally disappeared. Well, as I began to raise my head to see what was happening, the ground started shaking, and I heard this loud roar as this sleek Air Force jet flew right over the top of my head. Folks, it was so low that I could smell the fumes. I could see the fire coming out of the tail. As I stood there looking, it kept coming down closer and closer to the ground. But then, all of a sudden, the pilot pulled it straight up, and he began to turn it around and around. It was a bright afternoon. The sun's reflection off that silver body was so bright that it almost blinded me. And then I heard this loud boom, and a plume of fire came out of the tail as the pilot had kicked that jet in the afterburner, and it literally disappeared up into that clear sky. Now, folks, you got to understand that I had never flown on an airplane before. I had never even seen one up close on the ground. And so watching this whole experience take place before my very eyes was the most exciting and exhilarating thing that I had ever seen. And I didn't realize it at the time, but the seed of my dream to fly jets was planted that very afternoon. But I got to tell you, as a young black boy in the segregated South, I was a million miles away from achieving that dream. A million miles away from becoming the first African American from South Carolina to attend the Air Force Academy. A million miles away from becoming an Air Force pilot and flying faster than the speed of sound, or a Delta captain and sitting in the cockpit of a jumbo jet. Yet, I achieved not only those dreams, but also my dream of becoming a lawyer and being one of the few who can argue before the Supreme Court of the United States, of becoming a multimillionaire businessman and a civic and a governmental leader. And I attribute it all to 3 things. Number 1, the love and guidance of my parents. Number 2, having the courage to both go and stay at Orangeburg High. And number 3, becoming an Air Force Academy graduate and a proud member of the Long Blue Line. Now, I grew up with no exposure to aviation, but I got a friend who was surrounded by it. And he had an early goal of one day becoming an airline pilot. You see, he grew up in LA, near LAX, and he saw the airplanes taking off and landing almost every day. His mother was a flight attendant. His uncle was an airline pilot who seemed to really enjoy his life, and from my friend's perspective, lived an exciting life as well. And so he came to the academy specifically to learn how to fly and to chase that goal. Now, he did well here academically, but he'd be the first to tell you that he wasn't the best cadet, a fact that he regrets to this very day. But at the time, he was here to be an airline pilot. He didn't have time for that military stuff. Well, after graduation, he went on and got a master's at Columbia on the pilot training where he did well, and he got assigned a Recce F4. You guys know what Recce means? Reconnaissance, RF4. He could go fast and low. Then after that, he got an F-15, and he would tell you that he was having the time of his life. Well, on a whim, he decided to apply to test pilot school. Figured he could combine his engineering degree with his love of flying those fast jets, and besides, it would look good on his application when he applied for that airline job. He got assigned to Edwards Air Force Base, which was cool because he could drive down to LA, see his family and friends on the weekend. Well, on one of those trips, he went to a party, was talking to some airline pilots, and they said, "Man, your time is right. The airlines are hiring. Just get your application in, and we'll help you out," because, of course, they were friends of the family. Well, he left LA that night, driving back out to Edwards, feeling pretty good. I mean, his lifelong dream finally within reach. But then he started having some doubts because, you see, he was really enjoying test pilot school. And on the drive back, he went back and forth, until going through the gate at Edwards, he had made his final decision. He was going to stay in the Air Force because he enjoyed what he was doing. Well, he finished top of his class, went on to be a great test pilot and a NASA astronaut. He flew 3 space shuttle missions, commanding his 3rd mission, appropriately named STS-76, because he was a member of the Academy's class of 1976. He took advantage of an opportunity to come back to the regular Air Force after his NASA career, and a year later he was a brigadier general. And Kevin Chili Chilton would go on to become a 4-star general, commander of Air Force Space Command, commander of U.S. Strategic Command, and to this day remains the only former astronaut to have become a 4-star general. You know, they say that you can determine the prestige of an institution by the accomplishments of its graduates. And if you look at the stories of Air Force Academy grads, you'll quickly understand why we've become such a prestigious institution in a short 62 years. Like the story of the young Jewish kid, classmate of mine, from Toms River, New Jersey. His dad sold typewriters. His mother, at an early age, had mental illness and was confined to an institution. So he grew up with no female influence in the home. His dad was a very demanding man. That in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing, but he was also cold and hard and didn't show much affection at all. In fact, he was extremely hard to please. My buddy would sometimes wonder whether he could do anything right in the eyes of his dad. Well, his older brother went off to college. A couple years later, he was looking through brochures, and his dad told him he only had the resources to send one kid to college, the older one, that if he wanted to go to school, he better start looking for a scholarship because otherwise he'd be working in the family store. Well, he didn't want to work in the family store because he had an interest in flying. So he applied to the Naval Academy, but he didn't get in. A teacher of his suggested that he might consider applying to the Air Force Academy, which was a school he'd never heard of back on the East Coast. Checked it out, applied, but he didn't get in. But he was the first alternate. The principal was a high school quarterback, star, one town over. They had actually played against each other in school. Well, as it turned out, the star quarterback blew out his knee. And so the Air Force decided to pass on him because they figured he couldn't pass the physical. And that's how my friend got to the Air Force Academy. He did well here on the soups list, became a squadron commander, and he and I served together back in those days as 2 of the 5 Firsties on the cadet wing staff. After graduation, he went to pilot training, had a tremendous Air Force career. In fact, he made 06 in 15 years. He was known as the boy colonel in the special ops arena. He would go on to become a 4-star general, and Norty Schwartz would become the 19th Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. And then there's the story of the young girl who was a military brat because her father was an Air Force pilot, traveled a lot during her formative years, and ended up going to high school in Dayton, Ohio, because her dad was stationed at Wright Pat. She never thought much about where she'd go to college or what she wanted to be. Kind of figured she'd go to Wright State University right there in Dayton. And because she was good at math, she'd become maybe a scientist or an engineer. And then one day her dad came home and said, "Hey, the service academies are opening up to women. You ought to check it out." And she did, and discovered that the Air Force Academy was one of the top engineering schools in the country. And so she applied and found herself here in the summer of '76 as a member of the class of 1980, the first academy class that included women. Now, that would have been cool with me if it had happened during my time, although it might have made it more difficult for me to get through school. But as you might imagine, there were some male cadets that didn't like that. In fact, she can remember this Firstie coming up to her when she was a dually and telling her that she and her female classmates didn't belong here. And he was going to do everything in his power to make sure that she failed. Despite the harassment and the hazing, she didn't fail, he did. And in 1980, she, as well as her other female classmates, made history by graduating as the first class of females from the academy. She would go on to get a master's in both aero and astro from MIT and enjoy an outstanding Air Force career. But she wasn't finished making history yet. And in 2012, Janet Wolfenbarger would become the first woman 4-star in the United States Air Force. Now, this next story could have been right out of Hollywood, but it started up in North Texas. A young kid who would sneak his dad's expensive binoculars and track those jets that would fly overhead from nearby Perrin Air Force Base, close to his hometown in Denison, Texas. He was just enthralled by these jets, what they look like, how they sound, and the physics that enable them to fly. But most of all, he was impressed by the pilots who rocketed him across the sky. At 11, he got his first airplane flight, a trip from Dallas down to Austin. And he was just blown away by the experience of it all. And he realized then and there that that's what he wanted to do for the rest of his life. At 16, he was taking flying lessons, and he would always say that his first solo was his most memorable flight. At 19, he was at the Air Force Academy, a member of the class of 1973. He would go on to become the outstanding cadet in airmanship, pick up a master's from Purdue prior to going to pilot training, where he did well, became a fighter pilot, flew the F-4D. But after his obligation was up, he got out and went with the airlines, completing that circle back to that very first flight. Now, while his most memorable flight was his first solo, his most famous flight occurred on January 15th, 2009, as captain of U.S. Airways Flight 1549. They took off out of New York's LaGuardia Airport, and on climb out, encountered a flock of Canadian geese, losing both engines at low altitude. Through skill, experience, and he'd tell you a lot of luck, they were able to put that jet down on the Hudson River, saving all 155 passengers on board. And from that day on, he would be known as the hero on the Hudson. And Captain Chelsea Sullenberger, currently the subject of the Clint Eastwood-directed movie starring Tom Hanks, simply called Sully. You see, these are the stories of Air Force Academy cadets who've gone on to become Air Force Academy graduates who have built the reputation of this school. And those are only a few stories. The fact of the matter is there are thousands more. In fact, 47,802 to be exact, one for every graduate of this great school. Every one of the 655 grads who've gone on to become general officers and the 37 who've reached the 4-star rank has a story. And every one of the 40 who've gone on to become NASA astronauts and the 38 who've won Rhodes scholarships has a story. And every one of the 36 who were POWs and the 185 who have their names etched in the black granite of the Graduate War Memorial has a story. Folks, let's take a moment of silence for our fallen grads. Thank you. And while we each have our own individual stories, yet we're all connected as a group, because what brings us together and what binds us are our common experiences. Now, the most obvious, of course, is getting through this institution in 4 years, right? Or in your case, 3.5, but I'm cautiously optimistic. And while things have certainly changed over the years because time moves on, and that's the very definition of change, yet because of heritage and tradition and fundamentally who we are, many things remain the same. Folks still taking Aero and Astro, right? Still standing Sammys and marching in parades? And by show of hands, how many of you have ever pulled an all-nighter studying for GRs, getting your room together for an inspection, or trying to get a project due, right? Hey, so I'm 44 years ahead of you, and I've been there and done all that too. But what really connects us and distinguishes us from every other university in the country is the focus we have on our core values. Tell you what, let's say them together. Integrity first, service before self, excellence in all we do. You see, our core values are our underpinning. They are our foundation. They are the things that separate us from others who accept being average and take us to a higher plane of living a life of exceptionalism. Who knows who General Ron Fogelman is? Anybody? Yes, sir. You are absolutely right. You were a little shaky there for a while being a great class, but he pulled you out. So, for the audience, General Ron Fogelman, class of 1963, was the first Academy grad to become Chief of Staff of the Air Force. And he came back to speak to the cadets in 2015, the class of 2015, at their 100th night. And he told the story of how, as the 15th Chief of Staff, he instituted the Air Force's new core values. Does anybody here know where the idea or the inspiration for those new core values came from? You are absolutely right. The new Air Force core values were actually the Air Force Academy's core values at the time. Now, I know you've had instruction on the core values and on ethics and on the honor code because the AOG actually funds a lot of that leadership training that you've been through. And on occasion, I've had the opportunity to both observe and to facilitate some of those leadership courses. And when I facilitate, I've been known to, as some people say, ask some provocative questions. But what I find is often you don't agree among yourselves on the answers. For example, I'll ask you today by a show of hands, how many of you would agree that the core values are equally important? Okay, some do. And those that don't believe that they are of equal importance, then the next question would become, well, how would you rank them and how would you categorize them? Is it the way that we say them, or is it some other different ranking? Again, it'll generate a lot of discussion around the table. Now, for the record, I fundamentally believe that our core values perfectly capture the essence of how we should try to live our lives. But I don't believe they're of equal value. And I wouldn't say them the way that we do. For me, I would go integrity first, then excellence, and then service. So let me discuss that for a minute or two so I can explain my view. And we'll begin with integrity first. And here is a dictionary definition of integrity. Okay, question for you. Does integrity mean following the rules? Or let me ask it a different way. If you were to habitually break the rules, not follow the regulations, and even break the law, would you be living a life of integrity? How many of you believe under that scenario you could not be living a life of integrity? Okay. Well, it really kind of depends, doesn't it? Maybe, maybe not. Another question. How many of you always drive the speed limit? That's a rhetorical question. I don't need hands. We don't want anybody to self-incriminate or, God forbid, commit an honor violation at this point in your career. But here's the deal. Integrity generally won't come into play if you drive up to Denver on I-25, speed limit 75, but you consistently, because of habit, put your cruise control on 80. Because you see, going 5 miles over the speed limit's got nothing to do with morality or telling the truth. Although technically, you are consistently, habitually breaking the law. Likewise, and this is provocative, warning, there's nothing immoral or untruthful about cadet underage drinking. Now let me be clear, because I don't want the super the commandant mad at me, okay? I'm not suggesting nor do I condone underage drinking by cadets, okay? Again, so that I'm clear, I do not condone underage drinking by cadets. But the fact of the matter is that assuming the drinking age is 21, and it varies from state to state, integrity generally doesn't come into play if you take a drink when you're 20 years, 364 days old, or if you take a drink when you're 20 years, 366 days old. But if you have made a commitment up front or a promise not to engage in underage drinking, or the more likely cadet scenario, you've done it and somebody asks you about it, usually somebody in a position of authority like your AOC, well then you got to be a person of integrity. You got to tell the truth, own up to it, and then accept whatever the consequences may be. All right, excellence in my lineup, and here's a dictionary definition of excellence. Okay, question for you. If you were to perform a task and you did it perfectly, would you have done it with excellence? Or, to ask the question a different way, does excellence equal perfection? Well, again, maybe, maybe not. And I know my math folks are having a little trouble with this because y equals x, x equals y, right, in math. But not necessarily here. Perfection may equal excellence, but excellence doesn't have to equal perfection, because excellence is doing your absolute best. And if you do something to the best of your ability, but it wasn't perfect, then in the context of your ability, you've done it with excellence, because you have done the very best that you can do. Now, conversely, Let's say you're a class sprinter. You run the 100-meter, big race, and you blow away the competition, win it by 4 meters. But you know deep down, and I know because I'm your coach, that you didn't run that race best that you could run it. That if you had, you'd have won by 7 meters, maybe even broken the record. Well, even though you blew away the competition, even though you've won the gold medal, you didn't perform in an excellent manner. And finally, service. Here's a dictionary definition of service. And that's why I put service last, because quite frankly, it's what you're already doing. You are serving in the United States Air Force, currently, for the American people. You weren't drafted, you volunteered in a time of war. You're protecting the country against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Now, can you do more? Yeah, sure you can. But just by sitting here in uniform, you've already met this definition. Working for somebody else, meeting a public need. So here's the question: how does all this matter in your day-to-day lives as a practical matter? Well, you're going to graduate in 6 months. You're going to become members of the long blue line. And I wore this shirt today just for that line. You're going to get your 60 days of leave, and then you're going to come back, and you're going to be in the real world. The real world is you're going to be getting up every day and going to work as an Air Force officer. You may be learning how to fly an airplane. You may be working satellites, contracting, acquisitions, whatever. But here's the deal. Here's you, and you're going to have a supervisor, a boss for the first time. You're going to have colleagues similarly situated, and a lot of you are going to be leading airmen for the first time. Now, given that Academy grads only encompass about 20% of the officer corps, it's a good bet that most of the people you're going to be dealing with are not going to be Air Force Academy grads. But you know what? They're going to know that you are, and they're going to be watching you. And whether you want to be or not, you're going to be representing this institution and other Academy grads. And that's where the core values come in. That's where the rubber meets the road. Because the first thing you're going to have to do in your new environment is to build trust. Certainly you want to build trust with the person who's going to be evaluating you. You want to build trust with your colleagues, and most definitively, you have to build trust with the people that you're leading. And the way you build trust is by being a person of integrity, by doing what's morally right, and by telling the truth. I tell your staff at the AOG all the time, do the right thing for the right reason and in the right way, and no matter what happens, I got your back 100%. And immediately after building trust, the second thing you're going to have to do is to start working on your reputation. Or in today's lexicon, building your brand, right? And how do you build a strong brand? By being excellent at what you do. By having the discipline to go out every day and be the best that you can be. And if you do that, you'll find that you're going to be ahead of most of your contemporaries. And it's not that just because you're an Academy grad that you're better than the ROTC or OTS grad, but it's because that as an Academy grad, you have been given a better opportunity. You have been given a privilege by the American people to attend this university. Okay? But here's the deal. Whether you take advantage of that head start that you've been given or not, it's totally up to you. And, unfortunately, there have been grads that have come before you that hadn't figured that out. And finally, service. And as I said, you're already doing that, but you'll have to do more. My classmate, friend, former Chief of Staff of the Air Force specifically asked me to tell you to volunteer to do the things that others won't do. And he told me the story of how, as a young lieutenant, he volunteered to do a change of command ceremony. Kind of an irritant job, but no heavy lifting for an Air Force Academy grad. But he did an excellent job. And the visibility he got, the contacts that he made, which blossomed into relationships with senior officers, were instrumental in his rapid rise up the Air Force ranks. Often when professional qualifications are the same, It is service that makes the difference. Are you working with the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts? Or have you volunteered for the Cancer Society? Are you volunteering for additional duties in the squadron? Are you in a leadership role with the local chapter of your AOG? You see, after integrity and excellence, service is the distinction that'll move you ahead in both civilian and military life. Now let me go back to those 5 cadets on that panel that I talked about before. It's a panel called 1 in 4,000 Lessons in Character. And I want to give you just a window into the lives of those 5 cadets, just a peek. The first was from Rwanda, Joseph Abakunda. Joe survived the Rwandan genocide. He told the story of fleeing Rwanda to get to a refugee camp in Uganda, of being chased by his enemies, of being stalked by lions, of having to ford crocodile-infested rivers, and living on grass and berries because they had nothing else to eat. He was in that refugee camp for a generation. His was a story of resilience and reconciliation. He talked about the complexity of having to come to terms as a survivor of the genocide, of eventually learning to live again side by side with the people who had murdered his family and friends. Next cadet from Tunisia, Muhammad Galala. So Muhammad fought in the revolution of the Arab Spring. His story reminded us that not all of your enemies are foreigners, and sometimes they're domestic, in fact, your fellow citizens as well. He talked about the chaos that ensued as a result of that revolution, and how after being out of basic training for only 3 months, he was ordered to fire into a crowd that included his relatives and friends, and how he refused that order, how it fundamentally changed his life and his view of the military. Well, Muhammad is back in Tunisia today as an Air Force Academy graduate, training to be a fighter pilot. I forgot to mention that Joseph is back in Rwanda as a helicopter pilot today. And then the 3 Americans. The first, Heather Shepard. Heather never knew her father because her mother was a prostitute, drug addict, and alcoholic. Until she was 7, she was the adult in the family, taking care of her younger siblings. She says she remembers being afraid and hungry most of the time, but when she did get food, she made sure that her siblings, younger siblings, ate first. After age 7, she was in and out of foster care, deemed to be a delinquent and troubled kid. She ended up as a junior in high school in a boarding school for at-risk teens. And that was her first exposure to the Air Force Academy through a brochure. Changed her life. She bought into the concepts of integrity and excellence and set as her #1 goal getting into this Air Force Academy, a goal that she achieved. Today, Heather is a lieutenant in our Air Force, serving as a contractor officer. Next cadet, Shane Culver. Shane is from Texas, had a lifelong dream of attending the Air Force Academy, a dream that was shattered by a football injury followed by a horrendous car accident. He broke almost every bone in his body, including 6 vertebrae in his back, suffered extensive nerve damage, was in a hospital bed for months upon months upon months. The doctors told him that he couldn't do physical therapy because the risk for paralysis was so high. that he would probably never walk again. But it was his desire to come here, to serve, to be a part of something larger than himself that gave him the motivation to get himself up out of that hospital bed and to build his strength up again. Well, as you, many of you know, Shane is one of you in Cadet Squadron 22 and a member of the class of 2017. Shane, where are you? Stand up and be recognized by your class. And finally, Johannes Salimo. Johannes from a big family in central LA. But his father died, and his mother was institutionalized because she was bipolar. They lost their house. The younger siblings scattered across LA in foster care. He, as a teenager, essentially homeless. So he moved into his high school. Literally. He said he played every sport that he could, joined every school club that he could, because he had to stay at high school as much as he could. He had no place else to go. Everything he owned was in his school locker. And nobody knew it, but he slept under the stairwell at night. Bright kid. He had scholarships to MIT and Stanford. But he came to the Air Force Academy because cadets got paid. And he worked a deal with the Air Force to send his cadet pay back to LA to support his family. These are the stories of Air Force Academy cadets that have gone on to become Air Force Academy grads. Shane, you'll get there soon. And you know, sometimes I wonder, where do we find these kids with such grit, determination, and character? And of course, the answer is they come from all across the country, indeed all around the world. And sometimes when I'm talking to what I call the grumpy old grads, in 67, you guys are not in that category, and they'll talk about how the kids of today are not as tough, or they don't have the right stuff that they had when they were cadets. Well, I respectfully, but very forcefully tell them that I disagree. And I want you to know that come May, without any hesitation or reservation, I'm going to be proud to welcome each and every one of you, the class of 2017, but as new members of the Long Blue Line. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and you are dismissed.